A man on a quiet trail stumbles upon a sight that stops him in his tracks. A wild Mustang lying in the dirt, its body battered and barely clinging to life. Alone in the wilderness with no one to call for help, he faces an impossible decision. What he does next will change everything for the horse and for him. This is a story of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bond that can form between man and nature. The morning sun filtered through the dense forest, casting golden rays on the winding dirt path where Mark Stevens jogged every weekend. A 42-year-old firefighter, Mark used these runs to clear his mind and connect with nature. But that day his peaceful routine was interrupted by something he never expected. As he rounded a bend near a shallow creek, a faint movement caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a fallen tree limb swaying in the breeze, but as he approached, the outline of a large animal became clear. His heart sank. It was a horse, no, a Mustang lying in the dirt, its sides heaving with labored breaths. The animal looked to be on the brink of death. Mark slowed his pace, his instincts as a first responder kicking in. He crouched a safe distance away, his trained eyes assessing the situation. The Mustang's coat, once a rich chestnut, was matted with dirt and streaked with blood. Its legs were covered in scratches, and its left hind leg was swollen, likely sprained or broken. Its head rested in the mud, its dark eyes glassy but filled with fear. "Hey, buddy," Mark said softly, his voice calm and steady. He knew better than to rush an injured wild animal. The horse flinched at the sound, its ears flicking weakly. Mark stayed still, letting the Mustang grow accustomed to his presence. His mind raced with questions. How had this magnificent creature ended up like this? And more importantly, what could he do to help? The forest was eerily quiet, the usual birdsong and rustling leaves replaced by the shallow, uneven breathing of the Mustang. Mark scanned the area for signs of what might have caused the injuries: a predator, a fall, or perhaps even an encounter with humans. But the path was empty, and the only tracks were the horses, leading back to the rocky incline. Above the creek, Mark's gaze returned to the Mustang. Its chest rose and fell in shallow bursts, each breath an obvious struggle. He felt a pang of helplessness. A wild Mustang wasn't like a domestic horse. This animal would fear him, resist him, and could even harm itself further if spooked. But leaving it here wasn't an option. He reached for his phone, cursing under his breath when he saw there was no signal. Of course, this far out in the wilderness, help was out of reach. "All right, Mark," he muttered to himself, "you're on your own." He considered his options. Carrying the horse was impossible, and moving it could worsen its injuries. He needed to stabilize it first. Glancing at his surroundings, Mark spotted a patch of tall grass in a nearby stream. He removed his jacket and approached slowly, cutting the grass with a pocket knife he always carried and dipping it into the cool water to create a makeshift compress. "Easy, buddy," he murmured, inching closer. The Mustang's ears twitched, and it tried to shift its weight, but the effort left it trembling. Mark stayed patient, his movements slow and deliberate. He pressed the damp grass to the swollen leg, the horse's muscles tensing under his touch. To his surprise, the Mustang didn't lash out. Its eyes flicked toward him, and for a brief moment, Mark thought he saw something: trust, or perhaps a desperate acceptance of his help. The hours passed as Mark worked to clean the Mustang's wounds with water from the stream and cover it with his jacket to keep it warm. The horse didn't fight him, though its breaths remained labored. As the sun began to dip below the treetops, Mark knew he had to make a choice. The Mustang couldn't stay here overnight, not with predators lurking and the temperature dropping. Mark stood and looked toward the path leading back to his truck, parked nearly 3 miles away. He had no rope, no trailer, no supplies, just his determination and a faint hope that he could save this animal. "I'm not leaving you," he said aloud, his voice firm. The Mustang blinked, its chest rising with another shallow breath. Mark took it as a sign. He would find a way, no matter how impossible it seemed. Mark stared at the injured Mustang, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his chest. He couldn't leave it behind, not when it was so close to giving up. But how could he move a creature this size through miles of rugged terrain without the proper equipment? Every logical part of him screamed that this was a losing battle. But something deeper, a stubborn instinct, refused to let him walk away. "All right, buddy," Mark said softly, crouching near the horse's head. "We're going to get you out of here one step at a time. He pulled his phone from his pocket again, hoping against hope that a stray signal might have appeared. Nothing. He sighed and scanned his surroundings. The dense forest offered few resources, but he noticed a large, sturdy branch lying nearby. If he could fashion some kind of sled, it might give him a fighting chance to move the Mustang. Mark set to work, stripping his jacket and shirt into long strips to use as ties. He propped the branch under the horse's body and looped the makeshift straps around its midsection, careful not to pull too tightly. As he worked, the Mustang twitched but didn't resist, its energy too depleted to fight. Rosie, his border collie, would have been his perfect companion for a moment like this. She always seemed to know when Mark needed encouragement. He thought of her safe at home, likely curled up on the porch waiting for him to return. "Looks like it's just you and me today," Mark said to the Mustang, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The Mustang's dark eyes blinked slowly, and Mark took a deep breath. "All right, let's do this." With a grunt, he pushed against the branch, testing the weight. It barely moved. Mark's heart sank, but he didn't stop. He adjusted the angle, wedging a flat stone under the branch for leverage, and tried again. This time it shifted slightly, the snow under the Mustang's body helping to ease the drag. "Good boy," Mark muttered, more to himself than the horse. He moved a few feet forward, planting his boots firmly in the snow before pulling again. The branch creaked under the weight, but held, slowly, inch by painstaking inch. He began to move the Mustang toward the trail. The effort was grueling. Mark's muscles burned, and his breath came in short bursts, visible in the frosty air. The Mustang moaned softly, its head lolling to one side as if unsure whether to trust the process. Mark paused often, leaning down to check its breathing and adjust the straps. By the time they reached the first bend in the trail, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Mark's legs trembled with exhaustion, but the sight of his truck, still a distant speck down the path, kept him going. "Not much farther," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring the Mustang or himself. As darkness fell, the forest grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. Mark's hands were raw from gripping the branch, and his shirtless torso, sacrificed to create the harness, shivered against the biting wind. He stopped briefly to cover the Mustang with his jacket, his teeth chattering as he muttered, "You're not the only one freezing out here, you know." The Mustang lifted its head weakly, its ears flicking at the sound of his voice. Mark chuckled softly. "I'll take that as a thank you." As they pressed on, Mark's mind wandered to his childhood. His father had been a rancher, a quiet but strong man who taught him to respect animals and the land. "They'll teach you more than you'll ever teach them," his father used to say. Mark hadn't fully understood it then, but now, trudging through the snow with a half-dead Mustang in tow, those words carried a deeper meaning. By the time they reached the truck, Mark's body was screaming for rest. He unlatched the tailgate and carefully maneuvered the branch into position, using every ounce of strength to slide the Mustang into the bed. The foamy breaths from the horse quickened with the effort, but Mark stroked its neck, his voice steady. "You're safe now. We're almost there." He climbed into the driver's seat, cranking the heat and glancing back at the Mustang in the rearview mirror. Its eyes were half closed, but its chest rose and fell steadily. Mark exhaled deeply, his hands trembling as they gripped the wheel. "Hang in there," he said softly, his voice cracking. "We're not done yet." The drive back to Mark's ranch was a blur. The winding mountain roads, already treacherous in daylight, had become perilous in the dark. Snow flurries danced across the windshield, and the truck's tires occasionally slipped on icy patches. Mark's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes flicking between the road ahead and the Mustang lying in the truck bed. The horse was still, its breath shallow but steady. Mark had secured it with blankets and rope, improvising a way to keep it from sliding with every sharp turn. As the lights of his ranch came into view, relief washed over him. The familiar silhouette of the barn stood out against the snowy backdrop, a beacon of safety. He pulled into the driveway, the crunch of tires on gravel breaking the silence. As he stepped out of the truck, the cold air bit at his skin, but adrenaline kept him moving. He lowered the tailgate carefully, speaking softly to the Mustang. "We're here, buddy. Just a little more." The process of unloading the horse was slow and painstaking. Mark had prepared a large stall in the barn, lining it with fresh straw and setting up a heat lamp to combat the frigid air. He used an old sled to maneuver the Mustang into the barn, every step a test of his endurance. By the time the horse was settled, sweat dripped down his back despite the freezing temperature. The Mustang lay in the straw, its chest rising and falling with visible effort. Mark crouched beside it, assessing its injuries in the better light of the barn. The swelling in its hind leg was severe, and several gashes along its flank were raw and inflamed. Mark frowned. These wounds weren't just from a fall. They looked like claw marks, mountain lion. He muttered under his breath, the realization sending a chill down his spine. He'd seen tracks in the area before, but had never encountered one this close to home. If the Mustang had been attacked, it was a miracle it had escaped at all. Rosie, his border collie, padded into the barn, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. She let out a low whine, her gaze fixed on the Mustang. "Yeah, girl," Mark said, running a hand over her head. "This one's been through hell." Mark grabbed his first aid kit and got to work. He cleaned the wounds as best he could, his hands steady despite his exhaustion. The Mustang flinched occasionally but didn't resist, as if it understood that Mark was trying to help. He applied an antiseptic to the gashes and wrapped the swollen leg with a clean bandage. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do until he could get a vet out to the ranch. As the hours ticked by, the Mustang began to relax, its head resting on the straw. Mark sat back on his heels, his body aching, but his heart lighter. "You're a fighter," he said softly. The horse's dark eyes flicked toward him, and for a moment, he thought he saw gratitude in its gaze. The foal in the next stall let out a soft nicker, reminding Mark of the horses he'd rescued before. Over the years, his ranch had become a refuge for animals in need, abandoned dogs, stray cats, even a deer with a broken leg. But this Mustang was different. It was wild, untamed, and its survival felt like a personal victory. That night, Mark barely slept. He dozed off in the barn, leaning against a bale of hay with Rosie curled up at his side. Every sound, the creak of the barn door, the rustle of straw, kept him on edge, as if expecting another threat to appear. But the night passed without incident, and by morning, the Mustang's breathing had steadied. Mark stepped outside, the crisp morning air filling his lungs. The snow-covered landscape sparkled under the rising sun, and for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. But as he looked back toward the barn, a nagging thought lingered. The mountain lion might still be out there. Determined to protect the Mustang, Mark spent the day fortifying the barn. He reinforced the doors, set up motion sensor lights, and even placed a trail camera nearby to monitor any activity. He knew it wouldn't stop a determined predator, but it was better than nothing. Then that evening, as Mark checked on the Mustang, he noticed something remarkable. The horse, though still weak, had lifted its head and was nibbling at the hay he'd left. It was a small sign of progress, but it filled Mark with renewed determination. "You're not just surviving," he whispered, "you're fighting." As he sat beside the stall, Rosie at his feet, Mark made a silent vow, no matter what it took, he would see this Mustang recover. They had come too far to give up now. The following morning, cold and clear, the air crisp with the scent of fresh snow, Mark stood outside the barn, his breath visible in the freezing air as he sipped his coffee. He scanned the tree line, his senses heightened. The attack marks on the Mustang haunted him, a constant reminder that danger still lurked in the wilderness surrounding his ranch. Rosie barked sharply, her tail stiff as she stared toward the dense woods. Mark's heart quickened. "What is it, girl?" he asked, setting his mug down and reaching for the rifle he kept by the barn door. Rosie growled low, her ears pinned back. Mark squinted into the shadows of the trees. For a moment, he saw nothing but the familiar expanse of snow and pines. Then, movement, a sleek figure darted between the trees, its golden fur catching the sunlight. Mark's stomach dropped. A mountain lion. The predator stopped at the edge of the forest, its piercing eyes locked on the barn. Mark's grip on the rifle tightened. He had no doubt what it wanted. The injured Mustang was an easy target, and the lion was likely the one responsible for the horse's wounds. Rosie's growl deepened, and the lion flicked its tail, its muscles tense as if weighing whether to advance. "Stay back," Mark muttered, raising the rifle. He aimed just above the lion and fired a warning shot that echoed through the still morning air. The lion flinched but didn't flee immediately. Its gaze lingered on the barn, then shifted to Mark. Finally, with a low growl, it turned and melted back into the forest, its golden coat disappearing among the trees. Mark exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping with relief, but the encounter left him shaken. The lion knew where the Mustang was, and it wouldn't give up easily. Mark needed a plan, and fast. Inside the barn, the Mustang lay quietly in its stall, unaware of the predator that had been watching. Mark knelt beside it, checking the bandages on its leg. The swelling had gone down slightly, and the horse's breathing was steady. It even nickered softly when Mark stroked its neck. "You don't know how lucky you are," he said, his voice tinged with both relief and worry. "But we're not out of the woods yet." Over the next several hours, Mark worked tirelessly to fortify the barn. He added extra locks to the doors and reinforced the windows with heavy wooden planks. He set up more motion sensor lights around the property, ensuring no corner was left in darkness. His trail camera, positioned to face the tree line, was set to record any movement near the barn. As he worked, the Mustang seemed to sense the urgency in his actions. It watched him with calm, dark eyes, its ears twitching at every sound. The foal in the next stall occasionally let out soft whinnies, adding a strange sense of normalcy to the tense atmosphere. By evening, the barn was as secure as Mark could make it. He sat on a bale of hay near the Mustang's stall, Rosie curled up at his feet. Exhaustion weighed on him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain lion would return. The hours dragged by, the quiet punctuated only by the soft rustle of hay and the occasional creak of the barn doors. Mark's eyelids grew heavy, but he forced himself to stay awake, his rifle resting across his lap. It was nearly midnight when the motion sensor lights outside the barn flickered on. Rosie shot up, barking furiously. Mark grabbed his rifle and moved to the barn door, his heart pounding. Peering through a crack, he saw the golden shape of the mountain lion prowling near the fence line. The predator's eyes gleamed in the artificial light, its body low and tense. It moved with eerie grace, circling the barn as if searching for a weakness. Mark steadied his breathing, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Not tonight," he muttered, opening the door just enough to step outside. He aimed the rifle and fired another warning shot, the crack of the gun shattering the silence. The lion froze, its ears flattening, but this time it didn't retreat immediately. Mark shouted, his voice echoing across the snow-covered yard. "Get out of here!" The lion growled, its eyes narrowing. For a moment, it felt like a standoff, man and beast locked in a silent battle of wills. Then, with a final snarl, the lion turned and bounded back into the woods, its movements quick and fluid. Mark stood in the cold, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He knew this wasn't over. The lion would be back, and next time it might not scare so easily. Back inside the barn, Mark checked on the Mustang, who stirred but remained calm. He stroked its neck, murmuring reassurances. "We'll keep you safe," he said, his voice resolute, no matter what. That night, Mark barely slept, his mind racing with plans to protect the Mustang. As the first light of dawn crept through the barn windows, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't just fighting for the horse's survival. He was fighting for its freedom. The sunrise painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, but Mark barely noticed as he stood at the edge of the barnyard, staring at the tree line where the mountain lion had disappeared the night before. The previous night's encounter had left him rattled, but he couldn't afford to let fear take hold. The Mustang's survival and its freedom depended on him. Inside the barn, the Mustang stirred as Mark approached. It lifted its head weakly, its dark eyes meeting him with a flicker of recognition. Mark smiled faintly. "You're tougher than you look," he said, crouching beside it to check the bandages. The swelling in its leg had gone down slightly, and the gashes on its flank looked cleaner. It was progress, but the horse wasn't out of danger yet. As Mark worked, Rosie barked outside, her tone urgent. Mark tensed, wiping his hands on his jeans before stepping out of the barn. Rosie stood near the fence, her body rigid and her gaze fixed on something in the distance. Mark followed her line of sight, his breath catching when he spotted movement in the snow. A figure emerged from the woods, not the mountain lion, but a man. He wore a heavy coat and carried a rifle slung over his shoulder. Mark recognized him immediately. Jim Barnes, a local hunter who often roamed the area. Mark's stomach tightened. He and Jim had clashed before over the issue of wild Mustangs, with Jim arguing that they were a nuisance to ranchers and wildlife alike. "What brings you out here, Jim?" Mark called, his voice calm but firm as the hunter approached. Jim stopped at the fence, his expression unreadable. "Morning, Mark. Heard some shots last night. Thought I'd come check it out." Mark folded his arms, his gaze steady. "Just keeping a mountain lion at bay. Nothing you need to worry about." Jim's eyes narrowed. "Mountain lion, huh? Dangerous business. You sure it's safe keeping animals in that barn of yours?" Mark felt a spark of anger flare in his chest. "They're fine. Thanks for your concern." Jim leaned against the fence, his gaze drifting toward the barn. "You know, word gets around, Mark. People are saying you got a Mustang in there. A wild one." Mark's jaw tightened. "What I do on my property is my business." Jim chuckled, but there was no warmth in the sound. "Wild Mustangs don't belong here, Mark. They're a threat to livestock, a drain on resources. You're better off letting nature take its course." Mark stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "That horse is injured, and I'm not letting it die out here because of people like you." Jim's smile faded, his expression hardening. "Suit yourself, but don't come crying to me when that lion finishes the job." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the woods. Mark watched him go, his fists clenched at his sides. The encounter left him uneasy. Jim wasn't the type to let things go, and Mark had no doubt he'd be back. Inside the barn, the Mustang lay quietly, its breathing steady. Mark stroked its neck, his mind racing with plans. He needed to get the horse to safety, somewhere far from the reach of both predators and people like Jim. But moving it in its condition was risky, and the nearest Mustang sanctuary was hours away. That afternoon, Mark called the sanctuary, explaining the situation to a woman named Claire who ran the facility. She listened intently, her voice calm and reassuring. "We can take the Mustang," she said, "but you'll need to bring it here. Our transport is tied up with another rescue." Mark glanced at the horse, its injured leg stretched out in the straw. "I'll figure it out," he said. "Thank you." After hanging up, Mark began preparing for the journey. He fortified the trailer, lining it with straw and adding padding to protect the Mustang during the ride. He packed medical supplies, food, and water, knowing the trip would be grueling for both of them. As evening fell, Mark stood in the barn, his hands resting on the stall door. The Mustang looked at him, its dark eyes calm but weary. "We're leaving tomorrow," Mark said softly. "It's going to be tough, but we'll get through it." Rosie barked again, her sharp tone cutting through the quiet. Mark's heart sank as he stepped outside and saw fresh tracks in the snow boot prints, leading toward the barn. His stomach churned. Jim had been here. Mark tightened his grip on the rifle as he scanned the area, but the woods were silent. Whoever had been there was gone now. But the message was clear. The Mustang wasn't just under threat from nature. It was under threat from people. Inside the barn, Mark leaned against the stall, his resolve hardening. "No one's taking you," he whispered to the Mustang. "Not while I'm here." As the wind howled outside, Mark settled in for another long night, his rifle within reach and his determination stronger than ever. The early morning sky was still dark when Mark loaded the Mustang into the trailer. The horse was weak but cooperative, as though it understood that this journey was its chance at survival. Mark worked methodically, speaking softly to calm the animal. The foal in the next stall whinnied as though in protest, but Mark reassured it with a gentle stroke before closing the trailer door. Rosie sat by the truck, her ears alert as she scanned the surroundings. Mark double-checked the straps securing the Mustang and took a deep breath. He had no time to waste. Every minute they spent here increased the risk of another visit from either the mountain lion or Jim Barnes. The truck's engine roared to life, and Mark guided it down the snowy driveway. The weight of the trailer made the drive slow and arduous, the icy roads demanding his full attention. Rosie sat in the passenger seat, her head resting on his lap, a quiet source of comfort. As the sun began to rise, the forest around them came to life. Snow sparkled on the branches, and the distant call of birds broke the morning silence. For a brief moment, Mark allowed himself to believe they might make it to the sanctuary without incident. But that hope was short-lived. Halfway down the mountain, the truck spun, shuddered, and jerked. Mark's stomach sank as the engine warning light flickered on. "No, no, no," he muttered, pulling over to the side of the road. Steam hissed from under the hood as he climbed out, his boots crunching in the snow. He opened the hood, the acrid smell of overheating coolant filling the air. Rosie barked sharply, her body tense as she stared down the road. Mark followed her gaze, his heart skipping a beat as he saw a familiar truck approaching. Jim Barnes, the hunter, pulled up beside Mark's vehicle, a smirk on his face. "Having some trouble, Carter?" he called, stepping out of his truck. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, and his boots crunched ominously in the snow as he approached. Mark straightened, his fists clenched at his sides. "What do you want, Jim?" Jim glanced at the trailer, his smirk widening. "Told you before, wild Mustangs don't belong here. You're just making things harder for yourself." Mark stepped in front of the trailer, his stance protective. "This horse is going to a sanctuary. You're not stopping me." Jim chuckled darkly, his hand resting on the rifle. "You're awfully stubborn for a man without options." Rosie growled low, her body tense as she stood between Mark and Jim. The tension in the air was palpable, the quiet of the forest amplifying every sound. "I don't want any trouble," Mark said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "But I'm not letting you near that horse." Jim's smirk faded, his expression hardening. "Suit yourself," he said, his voice cold. He turned and walked back to his truck, but Mark didn't relax. He knew Jim well enough to sense that this wasn't over. As the hunter drove away, Mark quickly returned to the truck. He checked the engine, realizing the damage wasn't something he could fix on the side of the road. Time was slipping away, and the sanctuary was still hours away. Desperation took hold as Mark made a decision. He unhitched the trailer, tying it securely to the truck to keep it stable. With Rosie at his side, he opened the trailer door and gently coaxed the Mustang out. "We're walking," he said softly, stroking the horse's neck. "It's not ideal, but it's our only choice." The path ahead was treacherous, the snow deep, and the cold biting. Mark led the Mustang slowly, careful not to strain its injured leg. Rosie stayed close, her keen senses alert for any signs of danger. Hours passed as they made their way through the forest. Mark's muscles ached, and the cold seeped into his bones, but he refused to stop. The Mustang stumbles occasionally, but Mark was there to steady it, his voice a constant reassurance. As they neared the edge of the forest, Mark heard a sound that made his blood run cold, a low growl. Deep and menacing, he turned slowly, his heart pounding as he spotted the mountain lion emerging from the trees. Its golden eyes locked on the Mustang. Rosie barked furiously, placing herself between the predator and the horse. Mark raised his rifle, his hands trembling as he aimed at the lion. "Stay back," he commanded, his voice firm. The lion hesitated, its body low and tense. It growled again, inching closer, its gaze never leaving its prey. Mark knew he had seconds to act. He fired a shot into the air, the sound echoing through the forest. The lion flinched but didn't retreat. As the predator prepared to pounce, Mark braced himself, knowing he had to protect the Mustang at all costs. Rosie lunged, barking and snapping at its heels. The distraction gave Mark the opening he needed. He fired another shot, this time hitting the ground near the lion. With a final growl, the predator retreated, disappearing back into the shadows. Mark collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving as relief washed over him. He turned to the Mustang, stroking its neck as he whispered, "We're almost there." The first light of dawn broke over the horizon as Mark, the Mustang, and Rosie emerged from the forest. The golden rays bathed the snow-covered ground in a soft glow, casting long shadows. As they approached the sanctuary's entrance, exhaustion weighed heavily on Mark's shoulders. But the sight of the sanctuary, a sprawling property surrounded by rolling hills and sturdy fences, filled him with a renewed sense of hope. A woman in her mid-40s, bundled in a thick coat, stepped out of the main building. Her name was Claire, the sanctuary's director, and her face lit up as she saw them. "You made it," she called, her voice warm and welcoming. Mark nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He glanced at the Mustang, who stood beside him, its breathing labored but steady. "We did," he said softly. Claire approached, her movements calm and deliberate. She reached out to the Mustang, letting the horse sniff her hand before gently stroking its neck. "What a beauty," she murmured. Her eyes shifted to the bandages on its leg, and her expression grew serious. "Let's get it inside." With Claire's guidance, Mark led the Mustang into a large, well-lit barn. The warmth inside was a stark contrast to the frigid air outside. Fresh hay covered the floors, and the scent of grain and wood filled the space. Mark guided the horse into a spacious stall where Claire immediately began assessing its injuries. "You've done an incredible job keeping this horse alive," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "Most people wouldn't have made it this far." Mark leaned against the stall door, his legs trembling with fatigue. "I couldn't just leave it out there," he said. "It deserved a chance." As Claire worked, Rosie sat at Mark's feet, her tail wagging softly. The Mustang stood quietly, its dark eyes watching Claire with a mix of curiosity and trust. Mark felt a pang of pride as he realized how far the horse had come since he first found it in the snow. After cleaning and re-bandaging the injuries, Claire stepped back and smiled. "This horse is a fighter. With some time and care, it'll make a full recovery." Mark exhaled deeply, the tension that had gripped him for days finally beginning to ease. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Claire placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're the one who saved it. You gave it a chance when no one else would." Mark spent the next few hours at the sanctuary, helping Claire and her team settle the Mustang into its new environment. The horse was given fresh water, a warm blanket, and a quiet space to rest. Mark stayed by its side, speaking softly to it as he stroked its neck. The bond they had formed over the past few days felt unbreakable, and letting go was harder than he had expected. When it was finally time to leave, Mark stood at the stall door, his hand resting on the wood. "You're safe now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Take care, buddy." The Mustang lifted its head, its dark eyes meeting him one last time. Mark smiled faintly, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. He turned to Claire, who gave him a reassuring nod. "We'll take good care of it," she said. "You can come visit anytime." As Mark walked back to his truck, Rosie trotting beside him, the weight on his chest began to lift. The Mustang was safe, and its journey was just beginning. Mark climbed into the driver's seat, glancing back at the sanctuary one last time before driving away. The road home was long, but the memories of the past few days stayed with him. He thought of the Mustang's resilience, its will to survive against all odds, and the connection they had shared. It wasn't just a story of survival. It was a reminder of the strength found in compassion and the power of second chances. As Mark pulled into his driveway, the first flakes of a new snowfall began to drift down. He stepped out of the truck, Rosie at his side, and gazed at the quiet ranch. Life would go on as it always did, but he knew he'd never forget the Mustang and the lessons it had taught him. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could change a life, and sometimes those acts ended up changing your own. As Mark drove away, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. The Mustang's journey wasn't just about survival. It was about the power of kindness and second chances. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who loves heartwarming tales. Together, we can spread messages of hope and compassion.